The following 4 stories are all shared by the same individual. The 5th story in this video is shared by someone else. 1. I was 13 and Daryl had just turned 12. Daryl and I were out setting up trail cams for Daryl's dad. I was on my horse, Zeus, and Daryl was on his horse, I can't remember, but his name was either Sleepy or Sleeper, and Buck and Blackie the Rottweilers were with us. Because of there being bear and cougar where we lived, both of us had guns. We both know how to use them, and we both knew they aren't toys. We were young, not stupid. I had my rifle, a .257 Winchester bolt action. I loved that rifle. And Daryl had what I believe was a 9mm pistol. We had just put the 4th trail cam up when we smelled the most god-awful smell. It was like a mix of decay and really bad BO. Daryl's horse was the first to start acting twitchy, which was not normal for him. Zeus also started to get agitated, but he was reacting out of anger by stomping the ground, snorting, and whining and baying very loudly. Daryl's horse would move side to side and stomp the ground, but he didn't make any noises. The fur on Blackie's neck would stand on end, and he was growling very lowly. Buck's fur was also standing on end, but he wasn't growling, at least I didn't hear him if he was. We had to put up 8 more trail cams, so we just kept moving. The stench never went away or got any worse. At first we thought it was just a dead animal, but something about it was off. I had smelled dead animals, and although it wasn't a good smell, I would rather smell that than the horrible smell of that fateful day. After we had set the next 3 more trail cams up, we had to cross the creek to set up the last few. The water was just high enough to skim the bellies of the horses. Blackie and Buck both had to swim, but this wasn't the first time they had crossed the creek that day, nor would it be the last in their lifetimes. Buck didn't mind it, he loved the water, and would be the first in and the last out, sometimes even swimming along the bank to watch us from the water. Blackie neither hated or loved the water, but would follow me to the ends of the earth and back. Once we got to the other side, we got off the horses. I dried their legs while Daryl set up another cam. That's when we heard this earth-shattering roar. It had to have lasted for at least 2 or 3 minutes. Sleepy, I still can't remember his name, but I'll call him Sleepy for sanity's sake, bolted, but he couldn't get very far being tied up. Zeus lowered his head and started snorting and stomping the ground. Buck and Blackie stared to the forest on the opposite bank, both now growling, fur on end. 4 more that we need to do, just 4 more, Daryl said, whether to me or himself I don't know, but I just nodded and I said, "I'm with you, man, let's hurry." Yes, I know, for 2 kids out in the woods by themselves, we should have been freaking out, but this is where we grew up. I was never afraid of my home or the woods around it. Even thinking back to it now, I wasn't the slightest bit scared. I was worried, yes, but I could defend myself and my animals. I had a gun, I was a good shot. I had my wolf dog, a half-crazed Rottweiler, and my best friend, whom was a good shot too. I know it sounds dumb or weird or whatever, but I felt safe at the time. We also hadn't seen anything. We got back on the horses and moved parallel to the creek for a while, before moving away from it. Buck was in front of me. I trusted the wolf half to warn us, if anything was ahead of us. Behind me was Blackie, whom had not stopped growling since we heard the roar. Behind him was Daryl, who was both trying to calm his horse and set up the last of the cams, so all he had to do was tie them to the trees. I had my rifle up at the ready position, but the safety was still on. I was the better shot on a horse, but in Sleepy's panicked state, if Daryl or I had taken a shot, he would have freaked out and ran with or without Daryl on him, so I really hoped I wouldn't have to. We set up 3 of the 4 cams, and were headed to the last spot to set up the cam when a rock was thrown at us. We didn't see it, but we heard it. Once we were done, we raced back to my house, which was the closest. Daryl stayed with me till I had unsaddled Zeus and put him out to pasture. I walked with Daryl to the creek's edge. We didn't talk about what happened. We never did talk about it. We lost the farm and I lost contact with Daryl. Oh, and to clear some things up, the reason why my brother wasn't with us is because he's special needs, and didn't much leave his room, let alone do anything involving guns. And Grandpa Badass was home feeding the animals. He was asleep in a chair under a tree by the garden. We used to call it him watching the garden grow when we got back to the farm. My grandma was working at the time. She was 11 years, almost 12 years younger than my 65-ish grandfather, and thus was still working at the age of 54-ish. 2. This happened a week or two after story 1. I was headed out to feed the animals after dinner. You have dinner at midday, and supper at night. It's a country thing, get over it. The sun was high in the sky, and it was hot. It hadn't rained in at least 4 or 5 days. We had all the barn doors open, and the whole place stunk to high heaven between the pigs and the goats. I had switched the routine of feeding them at midday, and cleaning in the early morning so as not to die of heat exhaustion. I had fed all the other animals but the horses and cattle which were together in the pasture. All I had to do was take 2 feed bags, 50 pounds each, and empty them into the troughs. I grabbed both bags and put them in the wheelbarrow, and away I went. When I got to the gate, I took one of the bags and slipped in between the bars. I emptied the bag, then went back for the other. I came back, and when I went to lift it to my shoulder, I heard Zeus loudly whining. I looked up and saw the single most terrifying thing I have ever seen in my life. I only had a minute to take in what I saw, but it's forever ingrained into my brain. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark reddish black fur, except for the face which had none. The fur also thinned on the back and chest and midway down its belly. I wasn't so close I could make out the face, but what I could make out looked like a mix between a man and a gorilla. That's the best I can describe it, but more like a man. It turned and I shit you not took 1.5 steps and was at the top of the steep hill. The hill was actually a levee and about 5 to 6 feet tall, and then 1.5 steps down to the other side. I forced myself to watch as its head and shoulders bobbed up and down with every step it took. Once it was out of my field of vision, I ran. I dropped the bag and ran back to the house. I have no shame in saying I needed to change my pants after that. I also didn't leave the house until my grandparents got back from my brother's doctor's appointment. Told my grandpa, and he and I went out to see if that thing left anything behind. We didn't find anything. I now believe that it was because it hadn't rained we didn't find any tracks, and didn't smell or hear it, because I was in the barn where the stinky animals were too loud. Zeus also charged that thing, but I can't be sure if that was why the thing went away or not. I'm also not sure if this thing is what we heard in the woods. 3. This happened just a few days after story 2. It was night time and I was having a hard time sleeping. It had rained for the last few hours and once again it was hot. I mean that sticky, don't touch me, you can hardly breathe, please just kill me now, H-O-T, hot. And we didn't have an air conditioner. This is actually why we got air conditioner window units. I had both of my windows open. They were on different walls, so I got a decent cross breeze. But I can't stress to you how hot it was, and I had a half-crazed Rottweiler who loved nothing more than to sleep on top of me. I just pushed Blackie off of me so I could go to the bathroom and get me a glass of water. When I came back, I laid on my bed, blankets off and only in my underwear. I had only been laying there for a few minutes. The bed beneath me was still a bit cool to the touch, when I heard footsteps coming up to my window that was directly in front of my bed. The other window was to my left, if one was to lay on the bed, and it looked right out over the side door, the main door we used, and the backyard. To be honest, I, at the time, thought I was just hearing things. That was until I heard heavy breathing and a sound that I could explain as a huffing. I didn't want to move. Whomever or whatever this was could clearly see me. A mostly naked, clearly female child laying on my bed. I thought if I didn't move, whoever was at my window would leave. Plus, I couldn't reach my rifle because it was in my closet locked up, and the key was in my desk right next to the window. There was a sudden tapping at the top of the window. I was crying at this point, but I still had not moved. That's when Blackie woke up and began to growl. The huffing began to get louder and angrier. Blackie started growling louder and barking. Whoever or whatever then smacked the side of the house close to my window and growled loudly. Blackie was now barking his head off, and I could hear my grandpa's footsteps coming down the hall towards my room. As soon as he reached my door, I jumped up screaming, "There is something at my window!" My grandpa grabbed me and pulled me behind him. He checked my wall around my window, and when we went outside, yes, I went with him, under my window in the mud, there were 2 huge footprints. The next day we got window air conditioning units, and my grandpa made wire cages to go around them. They made a lot of noise and were really hard to get off even with bolt cutters. We had to do it once when my grandma locked us out of the house. My grandpa said that this thing was a spiritual guardian of the forest, and needed to pay it tribute. 2 days after this happened, my grandpa and I took a basket with fruits, vegetables, honey, meats, and candies out to the woods and sang to the spirits. It never came back to the house. 4. It had been a month since the events of the first story. It was a Monday. I remember this because all Daryl and I were talking about was Monday Night Raw, wrestling for those who aren't familiar. We went out to collect the trail cams. I was again on Zeus and Daryl on Sleepy, still don't remember that damned horse's name. Blackie and Buck were with us as always. The ride was mostly uneventful. We did see a bear, but it turned and ran when it saw us. Buck started to chase it, but came back when the bear ran up a tree. It was beautiful out, but still hot and humid. We were also talking about going to the lake and going for a swim. We did, it was glorious. I had my rifle with me again, but this time Daryl had his rifle as well. Later that night we were at Daryl's house, as was custom for Mondays, while we were not in school. We had just had supper and his grandma was watching the news. Daryl's father was on his computer going through the trail cam photos. Daryl and I were in his room, waiting for Raw to come on. We heard Mike, Daryl's father, call for Debbie, Daryl's grandma. Daryl and I got quiet and he turned the TV down. "Mom, come here." "What, Mike? I just sat down." "Come here, what is that?" "Oh my God. It was right after the kids left, look." It went quiet for a minute. "Call Bob, get him down here. I won't let her walk home with something like that around here," Debbie said. An hour later, my grandpa showed up. Mike showed my grandpa the pictures. "Yep, that's the guardian spirit. Can you print these out? I want to show these to the other elders," my grandpa said. My grandpa used to live on the res before he married my grandma. We left soon after. I never got to finish Raw. I was so upset. A few days later, we went to the reservation to see the Native American elders. Okay, well, my grandpa went to see, and me, my grandma, my little brother TJ, and my mom were busy seeing family members and shopping. The rest of the summer, about a month or so, went by with no sight, smell, or anything. 5. It was around Thanksgiving a few years ago. I got home from work to find my brother and nephew were sitting in their truck, in their backyard next door. I started walking over to ask what they were up to, when a rotten odor nearly gagged me. It smelled like raw flesh and wet hair of a mangy animal. I then heard a low-toned growling or moaning coming from the tree line. I immediately joined them in the truck. We listened for maybe an hour. At times it was so loud that we could almost feel the vibrations from it. We could tell where the thing was, but could not see far enough into the brush to get a visual. It was dusk when this started, now dark. It paced the wooded area behind our houses several times, before finally fading away. None of us had an explanation or volunteered to take to the woods with a flashlight. The next night, the same thing happened again. My brother was prepared with a spotlight, but when we tried to shine it, all went silent for the night. We were sure it was over for good, but we were wrong. I got home early the third day, and was met by a farmer who lives on the opposite side of the highway from us. He told me that he was cutting weeds from his back pasture when a large piece of wood was thrown at him. He wanted me to go over and pick up his equipment he had left behind. He was very upset. He visited for a while, and we told him about our experience. Luckily for all our egos, our smelly friend made one final show. We heard a growl just like the last 2 evenings. Our farmer friend did something we hadn't thought of. He yelled at it. The vocalization immediately changed from the grunting into loud, high-pitched yodeling screams, as if it were trying to answer. The thing obviously started running away, but continued whooping. This was the first time we heard actual footsteps. I'm sure it was bipedal, as it sounded like a human running but pushing branches away as they went. My brother had a group of 5 girlfriends of his daughter staying with him at the time. He joked that all 5 plus his wife must have been on their period. He was more comfortable taking chances with Bigfoot than going in the house with the women. A neighbor, also a witness, theorized that it was the girl's condition that attracted Bigfoot in the first place. I thought it made sense, but didn't bring it up. While we couldn't claim to be eyewitnesses, I was soon approached by a guy that occasionally worked for me. His brother and 3 co-workers from a local construction company were headed home from work. When nearing my house, the driver blurted out, "Look at that monkey!" He stopped the truck as the creature crossed the road, about a 50-yard sprint. After a moment of silence, he remembered saying, "There ain't no monkeys here." He described it as 6 feet tall, dark in color, mangy and lanky. None of them knew of my recent experience, so this was amazing for me to hear. Yet another community member came forth after that. A farmer lady who lives just to my north confessed that she had become afraid to go out to her garden. She felt she was being watched or stalked while out there. The same spring, a Boy Scout troop took their annual canoe trip to the river that flows through the area. They were scared by loud vocalizations along the way, and consequently never went back. The following spring, I heard the groaning sounds again. This time not as loud and coming from the opposite direction. I dismissed them as a possible cow in distress. I called the farmer who owned the land adjacent to me and told him what I heard. He laughed at me and said he had sold all his livestock months earlier. My brother lives in between me and the area from which the noise was. Hoping to blame his dogs, I asked him, "What the hell is wrong with your dogs?" He replied that the dogs were cowering under the front deck and would not come out. Hey everyone, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to my Bigfoot Stories video. I've been meaning to do this for a while now. The first 4 stories I had for ages. I did actually have another story I didn't put in the video. That's because after the person sent it to me, they contacted me saying they'd got some details wrong, and they wanted to talk to family members, or maybe his father, before he resubmitted it. So that story will come later. I hope you all enjoyed it. When I decided I was going to do this, I kept getting the theme tune for, you remember the movie Bigfoot and the Hendersons? They did a TV show called Harry and the Hendersons. Well, I got the theme tune for that stuck in my head. You don't want you because your feet's too big and all that. But it seems to have quieted down now since I finished recording the video. Okay, I think I'm going to head off for now, so Until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.